The November rain fell in heavy sheets across the cobblestones of Thornfield Manor's grand courtyard, each droplet catching the gaslight that flickered behind the tall windows of the imposing Georgian mansion. Lady Catherine Ashford pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the coarse wool doing little to ward off the bitter cold that seemed to seep through to her very bones. Her once fine silk dress, now faded and patched, clung to her trembling form as she approached the massive oak doors that stood like sentinels before her. The brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, gleamed despite the dreary weather. Catherine's hand shook as she reached for it, then fell away. How had she come to this? 6 months ago, she had been the respected wife of Sir Edmund Ashford, mistress of a modest but comfortable estate in the countryside. Now, with Edmund's sudden death from consumption and the revelation of his crushing debts, she found herself destitute, her home seized by creditors, her servants dismissed, and her pride the only possession she had left to sacrifice. The gossips in the village had whispered cruel things about Baron Aldrich Blackthorne of Thornfield Manor. They said he was cold as winter frost, that no woman had ever warmed his bed or his heart since inheriting his father's title at the tender age of 18. At 30, he remained unmarried, dedicating himself entirely to expanding his considerable fortune through shrewd investments and his estates. Some whispered darker things, that his heart had been broken so thoroughly in his youth that it had turned to stone, that he viewed all human connections as weaknesses to be avoided. But Catherine had also heard other stories. Stories of his quiet generosity to the local orphanage, of debts forgiven during harsh winters, of employment offered to those others had turned away. It was these whispers of hidden kindness that had given her the courage to make this desperate journey in the midst of the storm. Taking a shuddering breath, Catherine lowered herself to her knees on the cold, wet stones. The sharp edges bit through the thin fabric of her dress, but she remained there, trembling not just from cold but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. Her pride, the last vestige of her former life, crumbled away like autumn leaves as she lifted the heavy knocker and let it fall 3 times against the door. The sound echoed through the courtyard like thunder, and for a moment Catherine wondered if anyone had heard over the howling wind. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and measured, approaching from within. The door opened to reveal a tall, austere man in butler's livery, his silver hair immaculately groomed despite the late hour. "Madam," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he took in the sight of the bedraggled woman kneeling before his master's door. "The hour is quite late for social calls." "Please," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I must speak with Baron Blackthorne. I have nowhere else to turn." The butler, whom she would later learn was called Grimsby, studied her for a long moment. Something in her desperate dignity seemed to move him, for he stepped aside with a slight nod. "Wait here," he instructed, gesturing to a small alcove just inside the grand entrance hall. "I will see if his lordship is receiving." Catherine remained on her knees even as she crossed the threshold into the warmth of the manor. The entrance hall was magnificent, all polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of stern ancestors looking down from gilded frames. The contrast between this opulence and her own desperate state was not lost on her, and she felt her cheeks burn with shame even as she shivered from the cold. Grimsby's footsteps faded up the grand staircase, and Catherine was left alone with the tick of an enormous grandfather clock and the drumming of rain against tall windows. She tried to prepare what she would say, how she would plead her case, but her mind felt as frozen as her fingers. "You may stand." The voice came from above, deep and cultured, with an edge of something she couldn't quite identify. Catherine looked up to see a figure descending the staircase with measured steps. Baron Aldrich Blackthorne was not what she had expected from the village gossip's descriptions. While tall and imposing, there was nothing of the ogre about him. His dark hair was touched with premature silver at the temples, and his face, though stern, held an austere handsomeness that spoke of good breeding and intelligence. He was dressed simply in a white shirt and black trousers, his jacket discarded in the comfort of his own home. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent, as if they held secrets too heavy for one man to bear alone. As they fixed upon her, Catherine felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. "My lord," she began, her voice steadier now that she was no longer shouting against the wind, "I am Lady Catherine Ashford. I have come to ask for your help." "I know who you are," he replied quietly, reaching the bottom of the stairs. He made no move to approach her, maintaining a careful distance. "I was sorry to hear of your husband's passing. Edmund was a good man, if not a wise one with his finances." The kindness in his words, delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone, nearly undid her composure entirely. "You knew Edmund?" "We served together briefly in Her Majesty's forces many years ago, before he married you and settled into civilian life." Baron Blackthorne clasped his hands behind his back, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes. "What is it you require of me, Lady Ashford?" Catherine took a deep breath, summoning the last of her courage. "Employment, my lord. I know it is unconventional, but I am willing to work. I can read and write, I speak French and Italian, I can manage household accounts, teach children." She trailed off, realizing how desperate she sounded. "I have no references to offer save my word, and I know that is worth little in my current circumstances." The silence that followed was excruciating. Baron Blackthorne's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts as he continued to study her. Just when Catherine was certain he would refuse, he spoke. "My ward requires a governess." Catherine's heart leaped. "Your ward, my lord?" "My late sister's daughter, Miss Evangeline Blackthorne. She is 14 and has proven challenging to previous governesses. The last 3 have departed within a month of their arrival." His tone was dry, suggesting this was something of an understatement. "The position includes room and board in the family quarters, a modest salary, and discretion regarding household affairs." "Good morning," he said as she approached, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident approval. "I wasn't certain you would come." "I gave you my word," Catherine replied, accepting the groom's assistance in mounting the mare. The familiar feel of being in the saddle after so many months was like greeting an old friend. They rode out across the estate in comfortable silence at first, following bridle paths that wound through ancient oak groves and across rolling meadows already touched with the gold of approaching winter. The morning air was crisp and clean, filling Catherine's lungs with a vitality she hadn't felt in months. "You have a good seat," Baron Blackthorne observed as they paused at the crest of a hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. "Better than most ladies of my acquaintance." "My father believed his daughters should be as capable horsewomen as his sons," Catherine explained, patting the mare's neck affectionately. "He said a proper seat on a horse was the mark of good breeding." "A wise man. And yet he allowed you to marry Edmund." The words slipped out before Baron Blackthorne seemed to realize he had spoken them aloud, and Catherine saw him stiffen in his saddle. "Edmund was a good husband," she said quietly, though without the defensive edge that might once have accompanied such a statement. Months of grieving had given her perspective on her marriage, its genuine affections as well as its limitations. "Forgive me," Baron Blackthorne said immediately. "That was an unconscionable thing to say. Your husband was indeed a good man, and you were devoted to him." Catherine studied his profile as he gazed out over the landscape, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the reins more tightly than necessary. "Why did you never marry, my lord? Evangeline is curious about it, and I must admit, so am I." For a long moment she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear him over the whisper of wind through the grass. "I was engaged once, when I was very young. Barely 22 and foolish enough to believe in fairy tales." He paused, his gray eyes distant with memory. "She was beautiful, charming, everything a young man dreams of in a wife. I would have given her the world. Catherine waited, sensing there was more to the story. I discovered, 3 days before our wedding, that she had been carrying on with my closest friend for months. They had been laughing at me, apparently, the lovesick fool who showered her with gifts and poetry while she shared her favors with another. His smile was bitter. I called off the wedding, of course. The scandal nearly destroyed both our families. "I'm sorry," Catherine said softly, meaning it. "It was a long time ago. But it taught me valuable lessons about the nature of romantic attachment and the wisdom of trusting one's heart to another." He turned to look at her then, his eyes searching her face. "Until recently, I thought those lessons had served me well." The implication in his words sent Catherine's pulse racing, but before she could respond, a sudden commotion from the valley below caught their attention. A runaway cart was careening down the hill toward the village, its horse clearly panicked and beyond the driver's control. Without hesitation, Baron Blackthorne spurred his stallion into motion, racing down the hillside at breakneck speed. Catherine followed as quickly as she dared, her heart in her throat as she watched him intercept the runaway cart with split-second timing, managing to calm the frightened horse and bring it to a halt just yards from the village square. By the time she reached them, a small crowd had gathered, praising Baron Blackthorne's quick thinking and skill. The cart's driver, an elderly farmer, was effusive in his gratitude, but Catherine noticed that her employer accepted the thanks with quiet dignity, refusing any suggestion that his actions had been particularly heroic. As they rode back to the manor, Catherine found herself seeing Baron Blackthorne with new eyes. The gossips had called him cold and unfeeling, but she had witnessed his genuine concern for his tenants, his affection for Evangeline, and now his instinctive courage in the face of danger. Whatever walls he had built around his heart, they had not destroyed his fundamental decency. "That was remarkably brave," she said as they approached the stables. "It was merely practical," he replied, but she caught a hint of color in his cheeks at her praise. "A runaway cart serves no one's interests. Nevertheless, you acted without thought for your own safety. Not everyone would have done so." He looked at her intently. "And what would you have done in such circumstances?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "I would have tried to help, though I doubt I could have managed it with your skill." "I believe you would have," he said quietly. "You have courage, Catherine. I saw it the night you came to my door in the storm." The use of her Christian name sent a thrill through her that she tried to suppress. They were walking a dangerous line, she knew, employer and employee, guardian and governess, their positions in society clearly defined. And yet, something was growing between them that defied such neat categories. Their morning rides became a regular occurrence, and with each passing day, Catherine found herself falling deeper under Baron Blackthorne's spell. Away from the formal atmosphere of the manor, he revealed himself to be intelligent, thoughtful, and possessed of a dry humor that made her laugh despite herself. He listened to her opinions with genuine interest, discussed literature and politics with her as an equal, and gradually began to share more of himself. She learned that he read voraciously, particularly works on social reform and agricultural innovation. That he had quietly revolutionized farming practices on his estates, improving conditions for his tenants while increasing productivity. That he corresponded with leading thinkers of the day and had even authored several articles on land management that had been published anonymously in scholarly journals. "Why anonymously?" Catherine asked one morning as they paused to rest their horses beside a babbling stream. "A baron who concerns himself with progressive ideas is seen as either a dilettante or a dangerous radical," he replied with a rueful smile. "Anonymous publication allows the ideas to be judged on their merit rather than their source." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "And yet the ideas matter to you enough that you pursue them regardless of potential criticism." "Some things are worth pursuing regardless of the personal cost," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from the manor, bearing news that guests had arrived unexpectedly. Baron Blackthorn's expression grew guarded as he read the missive, and Catherine sensed his withdrawal even before he spoke. "We must return immediately," he said formally, all trace of the warmth they had been sharing vanishing behind his aristocratic mask. "Lady Pembroke and her daughter have come to call, and it would be unseemly for me to be absent when they discover I am on the estate." The name Lady Pembroke meant nothing to Catherine, but clearly it held significance for Baron Blackthorn. As they rode back to the manor in tense silence, she found herself wondering about these unexpected visitors and why their arrival had affected him so profoundly. Her questions were answered soon enough. Lady Pembroke proved to be a formidable woman in her 50s, dressed in the height of fashion and possessed of the supreme confidence that comes with unassailable social position. Her daughter, Miss Arabella Pembroke, was a stunning blonde beauty of perhaps 22, with cornflower blue eyes and the kind of ethereal prettiness that graced fashion plates. Catherine encountered them as she was returning from the schoolroom that afternoon, having dismissed Evangeline early due to the arrival of company. The visitors were taking tea in the main drawing-room, and through the open doorway she could see Baron Blackthorn playing the perfect host, his manner formally courteous but unmistakably distant. "My dear Baron," Lady Pembroke was saying as Catherine passed, "you simply must come to London for the season. Arabella is to make her official debut, and I'm certain she would welcome a familiar face among the crowds." "How thoughtful of you to consider me, Lady Pembroke," Baron Blackthorn replied smoothly. "However, I fear my obligations here make such a journey impossible." Catherine quickened her pace, not wanting to eavesdrop, but Miss Pembroke's clear voice followed her down the corridor. "Oh, but surely a man in your position must consider the benefits of society? One cannot remain buried in the countryside forever. There are expectations, after all, regarding the continuation of one's line." The implications were clear, and Catherine felt her heart sink. Of course. Baron Blackthorn was 30 years old, titled, wealthy, and unattached. Society would naturally expect him to marry and produce an heir, and Miss Pembroke was exactly the sort of woman such expectations would thrust in his path. Young, beautiful, well-connected, and undoubtedly accomplished in all the ways that mattered to the ton. That evening, Catherine found herself unable to concentrate on her book as she sat in her small chamber. The sounds of dinner conversation and laughter drifted up from the dining-room below, reminding her of her place in the household hierarchy. She was staff, nothing more, and whatever tender feelings might be growing between herself and Baron Blackthorn were not only inappropriate but potentially ruinous to her position. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Evangeline, still dressed in her dinner frock but with a rebellious gleam in her eyes. "I couldn't bear another moment of Miss Pembroke's simpers," the girl announced, sweeping into the room uninvited. "She keeps batting her eyelashes at Uncle Aldrich and speaking in this ridiculous breathy voice about how overwhelming London society can be for a delicate female constitution." Despite her melancholy, Catherine found herself smiling. "I take it you don't approve of Miss Pembroke? She's beautiful, I suppose, if you like that sort of insipid prettiness," Evangeline said with the casual cruelty of youth. "But she's empty as a shell. She knows nothing about books or politics or anything interesting, and she actually giggled when Uncle Aldrich mentioned his agricultural improvements." Catherine settled into her reading chair, gesturing for Evangeline to take the other seat by the small fireplace. "Beauty and accomplishments are not always found in the same person," she said diplomatically. "No, but intelligence and character should matter more than a pretty face," Evangeline declared with conviction. "Uncle Aldrich needs someone who can match his mind, not just decorate his arm at social functions." The girl's words touched dangerously close to Catherine's own thoughts, and she struggled to maintain her composure. "Your uncle is perfectly capable of choosing his own companions. It's not our place to speculate about his personal preferences." Evangeline studied her with those disconcertingly perceptive gray eyes. "You care about him." It wasn't a question, and Catherine found herself unable to formulate a denial convincing enough to fool either Evangeline or herself. "I hold your guardian in the highest respect," she said carefully. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Evangeline leaned forward, her expression suddenly serious beyond her years. "He cares about you too, you know. I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." Catherine's heart lurched, but she forced herself to speak sensibly. "Even if that were true, which I cannot allow myself to believe, it would be impossible. I am a governess, Evangeline. He is a baron. The gulf between us is unbridgeable." "Is it?" Evangeline challenged. "You're gently born, educated, a lady by birth if not by current circumstances. And Uncle Aldrich has never cared much for society's expectations anyway." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of voices in the corridor made them both freeze. The dinner party was apparently breaking up, and Catherine could hear Lady Pembroke's carrying tones as the guests prepared to retire to their rooms. "We should speak of this no more," Catherine whispered urgently. "It would be disastrous if such speculation were to reach the wrong ears." Evangeline nodded reluctantly, but as she rose to leave, she paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think Uncle Aldrich would be far happier with someone who loves him for himself rather than his title and fortune. And I think you do love him, whether you'll admit it or not." After the girl had gone, Catherine sat staring into the dying embers of her fire, Evangeline's words echoing in her mind. Did she love Baron Blackthorne? The answer came with startling clarity. Yes, she did. Somewhere between their morning rides and quiet conversations, between witnessing his hidden kindnesses and gradually discovering the man behind the aristocratic facade, she had lost her heart completely. But love without hope was merely another form of torment, and Catherine knew she must find a way to guard her feelings before they destroyed her entirely. The next morning brought no opportunity for their usual ride, as Baron Blackthorne was occupied with showing his guests around the estate. Catherine threw herself into Evangeline's lessons with determined energy, trying to lose herself in the comfortable routine of education and intellectual discourse. It was not until late afternoon that she encountered Baron Blackthorne alone, finding him in the library as she sought a book Evangeline had requested. He was standing before one of the tall windows, his posture tense and his expression troubled. "My lord," Catherine said quietly, not wanting to startle him, "I apologize for the intrusion. I was merely seeking a volume for Miss Evangeline's studies." He turned at her voice, and she was struck by the weariness in his gray eyes. "Please, don't let me prevent you from your task. I was merely thinking." Catherine selected the requested book from the shelves, but found herself reluctant to leave. There was something in his demeanor that called to her, a vulnerability beneath his usual composure that made her want to offer comfort. "Are you quite well, my lord? You seem troubled." Baron Blackthorne was quiet for so long that Catherine began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Lady Pembroke has made her purpose in visiting quite clear. She wishes to arrange a match between myself and her daughter." Catherine felt the words like a physical blow, but managed to keep her expression neutral. "Miss Pembroke is very beautiful," she said carefully. "Yes, she is." He moved away from the window, beginning to pace the length of the library with restless energy. "She is everything society would consider a perfect match for a man in my position. Young, lovely, well-connected, accomplished in all the proper feminine arts." "Then perhaps you should consider the proposal seriously," Catherine forced herself to say, though each word felt like poison on her tongue. Baron Blackthorne stopped pacing and fixed her with an intense stare. "And what if I told you that the thought of marrying Miss Pembroke fills me with nothing but cold dread? That I have no desire for a wife who sees me merely as a title and a fortune?" Catherine's heart began to race, but she held his gaze steadily. "Then I would say you should trust your instincts. A marriage without genuine affection is a prison for both parties. Genuine affection, he repeated softly, moving closer to where she stood. Yes, that would be essential, would it not? But what of other barriers? What if affection existed where society deemed it inappropriate? They were standing very close now, close enough that Catherine could see the fine lines around his eyes, could catch the subtle scent of his cologne. The air between them seemed charged with possibility and danger. Society's approval is a cold comfort compared to the warmth of true connection, she heard herself say, though she knew she was venturing into treacherous waters. Catherine, he said quietly, her name a caress on his lips. You must know. Uncle Aldrich. Evangeline's voice from the doorway shattered the intimate moment like glass. Both Catherine and Baron Blackthorne sprang apart, and Catherine felt her cheeks flame with embarrassment and guilt. Miss Pembroke is looking for you, Evangeline continued, apparently oblivious to the tension she had interrupted. She's in the music room, and her mamma suggested she might play something for your entertainment. Baron Blackthorne recovered his composure first, though Catherine noticed his hands were not entirely steady as he straightened his cravat. Of course. Please give Miss Pembroke my compliments and tell her I shall join her presently. After Evangeline had departed, an awkward silence fell between them. Catherine clutched the requested book to her chest like armor, afraid to meet his eyes. I should go, she said quietly. Evangeline will be waiting for her lesson. Catherine, wait. Baron Blackthorne's voice stopped her at the door. What I was about to say. Please don't, she interrupted, finally looking at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. Whatever you were about to say, please don't. We both know it can lead nowhere good. She fled before he could respond, leaving him standing alone among the leather-bound volumes and dusty scholarly silence. That evening, Catherine pleaded a headache and took dinner in her room, unable to face the sight of Miss Pembroke charming her host with musical accomplishments and pretty conversation. She tried to read, to distract herself with the familiar comfort of literature, but the words swam meaninglessly before her eyes. A servant's knock interrupted her restless solitude, bearing an unexpected summons to Baron Blackthorne's study. Catherine's pulse quickened with a mixture of anticipation and dread as she made her way through the quiet corridors of the sleeping-house. She found him standing before the fireplace, still dressed in his evening clothes, but with his jacket discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked younger this way, less intimidating, and Catherine had to steel herself against the surge of affection the sight provoked. "You asked to see me, my lord?" He turned at her voice, and she was surprised to see something almost like vulnerability in his expression. "I owe you an explanation. For this afternoon, for many things." Catherine remained by the door, not trusting herself to come closer. "You owe me nothing, my lord. I am in your employ, nothing more." "Don't," he said sharply, then moderated his tone with visible effort. "Don't diminish what has grown between us with talk of employment and social positions. You know as well as I that what we feel transcends such mundane considerations." The directness of his statement took Catherine's breath away. "My lord, Aldrich," he said quietly. "My name is Aldrich. I should like to hear you say it, just once." Catherine's resolve wavered. "Aldrich," she whispered, and saw something kindle in his grey eyes at the sound. He moved toward her then, crossing the room with deliberate steps until he stood before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Catherine, I have tried to be honorable, to maintain proper distance, but I find myself quite beyond such noble intentions. The Pembrokes—" she began, but he silenced her with a gentle finger pressed to her lips. "Will depart tomorrow morning, disappointed but unengaged. I have already made it clear to Lady Pembroke that I have no matrimonial intentions where her daughter is concerned." His hand moved to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. How could I marry another when my heart belongs entirely to you? Catherine's breath caught at the declaration she had hardly dared hope for. Aldrich, the scandal, your reputation. Let society say what it will, he replied fiercely. I have spent 10 years living according to others' expectations, keeping my heart locked away for fear of betrayal. I will not waste another moment denying what I feel for you. But I am nobody, Catherine whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. A penniless widow, dependent on your charity. You are everything, he corrected, his voice rough with emotion. You are intelligent, courageous, kind. You match my mind and stir my soul in ways I thought impossible. Your circumstances do not define your worth, any more than my title defines mine. Before Catherine could voice any further protests, he lowered his head and kissed her, tenderly at first, then with growing passion as she responded in kind. In that moment, all considerations of propriety and social convention fell away, leaving only the truth of what they felt for each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Catherine found herself pressed against his chest, her fingers tangled in his shirt front. "Marry me," Aldrich said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't contain them a moment longer. "I know it's presumptuous, I know society will gossip, but I don't care. Marry me, Catherine. Be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things." Catherine's heart soared at the proposal, even as her practical mind raised objections. The difference in our stations. You are a lady by birth and breeding. Your temporary circumstances do not change that fundamental truth. His arms tightened around her as if he feared she might disappear. As for gossip, let them talk. Within a year, some other scandal will capture their attention, and we shall be free to live as we choose. Evangeline, Catherine began, thinking of her charge, adores you and has already suggested I would be foolish not to secure your affections permanently, Aldrich said with a soft laugh. She has been matchmaking quite shamelessly, you know. Catherine couldn't help but smile at that revelation. The little minx. I suspected she had ulterior motives in some of her comments. Then you'll consider it? My proposal. Hope and vulnerability warred in his expression, and Catherine realized that beneath his aristocratic confidence lay the same fears that plagued her, the fear of rejection, of loss, of hearts offered without guarantee of acceptance. "I love you," she said simply, and watched wonder bloom across his features. "I have tried to be sensible about the impossibility of it all, but I love you desperately, Aldrich. So yes, if you're certain this is what you want." Her words were cut off by another kiss, deeper and more passionate than the first, one that spoke of promises and forever. When they separated, both were trembling with the magnitude of what they had just committed to. "There will be challenges," Aldrich said seriously, his forehead resting against hers. "Not everyone will approve of our match. Some doors may close to us. Then we shall find new doors," Catherine replied with quiet conviction. "I would rather face society's disapproval at your side than live a life of respectability without you." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation and barely contained excitement. True to his word, Aldrich had politely but firmly discouraged Lady Pembroke's matrimonial ambitions, and the mother and daughter had departed Thornfield Manor with wounded dignity but no engagement to celebrate. The announcement of Baron Blackthorn's betrothal to his ward's governess did indeed cause a sensation in society circles, just as they had predicted. The reactions ranged from scandalized disapproval to amused speculation about the Baron's romantic nature finally asserting itself. But for every cutting comment and withdrawn invitation, there were also expressions of support from those who knew Aldrich personally and had witnessed his happiness in Catherine's company. "Let them whisper," Evangeline declared fiercely one afternoon as she helped Catherine select fabric for her wedding dress. "Uncle Aldrich hasn't smiled this much in all the years I've lived here. Anyone who truly cares for his welfare should celebrate his joy." The wedding itself was a small affair, held in the ancient chapel on the Thornfield estate rather than the grand cathedral ceremony that might have been expected for a baron's nuptials. Catherine had specifically requested simplicity, preferring the intimate gathering of close friends and family to a society spectacle. She wore a dress of ivory silk, elegant in its simplicity, with her auburn hair arranged in soft curls threaded with pearls that had belonged to Aldrich's mother. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of Aldrich's closest friend, a kindly gentleman who had served as a father figure since her own parents' death, she had eyes only for the man waiting at the altar. Aldrich stood tall and handsome in his formal attire, but it was the expression in his grey eyes that took her breath away. He looked at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he had never dared to voice, and Catherine felt her own face glow with answering radiance. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their vows spoken with quiet sincerity that moved more than one guest to tears. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Aldrich kissed her for the first time as her legal spouse, Catherine felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. "Lady Blackthorn," Aldrich murmured against her lips, testing out the title. "It has a lovely sound," Catherine agreed with a smile that rivaled the sun for brilliance. The wedding breakfast was held in Thornfield's grand dining room, transformed for the occasion with hothouse flowers and gleaming silver. Catherine found herself seated beside her new husband, still marveling at the turn her life had taken. Less than a year ago, she had knelt on these same doorsteps as a desperate beggar. Now she was mistress of this grand estate, wife to a man who loved her beyond reason. As if reading her thoughts, Aldrich leaned close during a lull in conversation. "Any regrets, my dear wife?" Catherine looked around the table at the assembled guests, Evangeline glowing with triumph at her successful matchmaking, Grimsby allowing himself a rare smile, various friends and neighbors who had accepted their unconventional union with grace and good humor. "Only one," she replied, and saw a flicker of concern cross his features. "I regret that it took us so long to find each other." The relief and love in his expression made her heart skip. "Then we shall simply have to make the most of all the years ahead," he said, raising his champagne glass in a private toast. "To new beginnings, my beloved Catherine." "To love conquering all obstacles," she replied, touching her glass to his. As the celebration continued around them, Catherine reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything she thought mattered, her first husband, her home, her social position, only to discover that what she truly needed had been waiting for her in the heart of a man who understood that love was worth any scandal, any sacrifice. The guests began to depart as evening approached, offering congratulations and well wishes for the couple's future happiness. Evangeline was among the last to leave, having lingered to help oversee the clearing away of the celebration's remnants. "I suppose I should congratulate myself on a job well done," she said with satisfaction as she hugged Catherine good night. "Though I do think Uncle Aldrich deserves some credit for finally showing good sense." "Indeed he does," Catherine agreed, glancing fondly at her husband as he spoke with the vicar. "Thank you, Evangeline, for your friendship, your acceptance, and yes, your matchmaking efforts." The girl grinned impishly. "I knew from the first day that you were perfect for each other. It was simply a matter of getting you both to see it." When the last guest had departed and the servants had cleared away the remnants of celebration, Catherine found herself alone with Aldrich in the drawing-room where they had first begun to understand their feelings for each other. The fire crackled warmly in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls and creating an intimate atmosphere that seemed to wrap around them like an embrace. "No second thoughts?" Aldrich asked, moving to stand before her as she arranged herself gracefully on the settee. There was still a note of wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe this happiness was real. "None whatsoever," Catherine replied firmly, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "Though I confess I keep expecting to wake and find this has all been an elaborate dream." "If it is a dream, then I pray never to wake," he said, capturing her hand and pressing it to his lips. "Catherine, my darling wife, I promise you, whatever challenges we may face, whatever storms may come, I will love and protect you for all the days of my life. And I will stand beside you through whatever fortune or misfortune awaits," she replied solemnly. "We have both known loss, Aldrich. We understand the value of what we have found in each other." He settled beside her on the settee, drawing her close against his side. For a long moment they sat in comfortable silence, watching the firelight dance and listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around them. "Do you think we'll be happy?" Catherine asked quietly, voicing the hope she hardly dared speak aloud. "I think," Aldrich replied, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head, "that we have already begun to be happy. The rest is simply continuing." And indeed, in the months and years that followed, the Baron and his unconventional Baroness did continue to be happy. They faced their share of challenges: social snubs from the stuffier elements of society, occasional financial pressures from Aldrich's progressive farming investments, the typical trials of any marriage, but they faced them together, their love growing stronger with each passing season. Catherine proved to be everything Aldrich had hoped for in a wife: an intelligent companion who could discuss literature and politics as easily as household management, a gracious hostess who won over even skeptical neighbors with her genuine warmth, and a partner who supported his progressive ideas with enthusiasm and practical suggestions. Aldrich, in turn, was the devoted husband Catherine had never dared to dream of: attentive without being possessive, supportive of her interests and opinions, and unfailingly gentle even in their rare disagreements. He had learned from his youthful heartbreak the difference between infatuation and true love, and he treasured Catherine accordingly. Their children, when they came, grew up in a household filled with laughter and learning, where books were as valued as bloodlines and kindness mattered more than convention. Evangeline remained a beloved part of their family, eventually making her own splendid marriage to a young scholar who appreciated both her intelligence and her spirit. The scandal of their unconventional courtship and marriage faded into fond local legend, the story of the desperate young widow who appeared at the Baron's door in a storm and won his heart through her courage and character. Visitors to Thornfield Manor in their later years would often be regaled with the tale by the couple themselves, who never lost their sense of wonder at the unlikely love story that had transformed both their lives. And sometimes, on stormy evenings when the wind howled around the ancient stones of Thornfield Manor, Catherine would remember that desperate night when she had knelt in the rain and begged for salvation. She had asked only for employment, for the chance to survive with dignity intact. Instead, she had found something far more precious: a love that transcended social boundaries and proved that the human heart recognizes no barriers save those we impose upon ourselves. "Do you ever regret it?" Aldrich asked her one evening as they sat before their fire, silver now threading both their dark hair but their devotion as strong as ever. "Giving up the chance for a more conventional life?" Catherine looked up from her embroidery with the same radiant smile that had captivated him decades earlier. "My darling husband," she said softly, "how could I regret the greatest adventure of my life?" And indeed, as she looked back on the path that had brought her to this moment, from desperate widow to beloved wife, from governess to baroness, from heartbreak to profound happiness, Catherine knew that every trial had been worth enduring for the joy of finding her true home in Aldrich's heart. Their love story had begun with desperate circumstances and social impossibility, but it had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting, proof that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most perfect endings. In a world obsessed with propriety and social status, Baron Aldrich Blackthorne and his beloved Catherine had dared to choose love above convention, and in doing so had found a happiness that all the approval in the world could not have provided. As the fire settled into glowing embers and the clock chimed the late hour, they retired to their chamber hand in hand, still as devoted to each other as they had been on their wedding day. Their love had weathered every storm, overcome every obstacle, and emerged not just intact but strengthened by the trials they had faced together. It was, truly, the secret love story that had transformed two wounded hearts into one unbreakable bond, a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstance and create happiness where none had seemed possible. And if the walls of Thornfield Manor could have spoken, they would have told of nights filled with laughter and days brightened by devotion, of a love story that began in desperation and bloomed into the deepest joy. For in the end, Catherine and Aldrich had discovered the most precious truth of all: That love, when it is real and true and fought for against all odds, is indeed worth any sacrifice, any scandal, any challenge the world might offer. Their secret had become their strength, their love the foundation upon which they built a life of genuine happiness and lasting devotion. And so they lived, loved, and prospered together until the end of their days, proof that sometimes the greatest love stories are those that begin not with fairy tale perfection, but with two imperfect people choosing to see past convention to the truth of each other's hearts.